Story number 10, hospital stays and hospital visits. For anyone who had known Chris throughout his adult life, they knew he suffered from mental illness. This affliction entered his life in his late teens, or perhaps it was his early 20s. At the time, I was still a teenager, and as such, I did not completely understand what had happened to Chris, or what he was being diagnosed with. Despite any diagnosis, I can comfortably say that for 95% of his life, he was perfectly fine. It was only a small 5% of time when he was a bit off, and when he needed support from specialists in a hospital environment. Chris lived his whole life, a good life, the very best he could, and I believe he accepted that he needed to deal with mental setbacks from time to time. Anyone who did not know him may say his life was not normal because of his illness, but I would argue and say his life was very normal, or perhaps even better than normal by being simply a bit next to normal, which made him extra special. I am quoting Next to Normal, a title of a musical presentation that I saw years ago in Toronto. This musical dealt with mental illness, and it was very enlightening in demystifying the complex layers of mental illness. Reader, should you ever have a chance to catch a production of it, I strongly recommend it. Nonetheless, in our views, in our family, we all loved every bit of Christopher, illness or not, just the way he was. Christopher's illness started, as mentioned above, in his late teens or early 20s. Prior to that, there were no signs of mental illness during his early years of childhood or schooling. From what I can remember, it was kind of like a light switch being turned on or off for him. It was during an Easter weekend when something changed. He went for a drive and did not return that day. It worried my parents so much that they went to search for him and found him in a strange state. They took Chris to the Shawville Hospital, and the doctors there advised that Chris be sent to the Ottawa General Hospital for specialized treatment. Chris was assessed and admitted for treatment in the psychiatric ward. I remember making trips with our family to Ottawa to go for visits to see our dear brother in those early days. I was too young at the time to be included in doctor meetings with our parents, but I believe he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. In those days, however, this term was used to cover a wide range of mental illnesses. Chris was not schizophrenic, but rather had bipolar disease. Mental illness, as I mentioned before, can be complex. Mental illness can range from a bad headache to someone dealing with stress on the lighter end of the spectrum, to a patient suffering from a manic depressive state, depression, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, eating disorders, and addictive behaviors. Anyhow, early visits to see Chris in this state were strange for me. I could just not figure out why he was now a bit different from before. At times it would be challenging to have conversations with him because everything he said was on high speed. He also was fidgety and only calmed down with hugs and calm words. At times the simplest things would send him into roars of laughter. Sometimes a single word would bring him to endless tears. It was all hard to figure out, but at least when he was laughing, he definitely made us all laugh. Laughter made him feel good. In his mind, at those moments, everything was just so funny and he would laugh. So we joined in and laughed with him. Chris went off, or when a wee bit next to normal, was never scary or frightening. He was never depressed or angry and would never hurt himself or anyone else. It was just all so different, and we all worked and prayed hard for him, hoping that he could find some relief for whatever was troubling him. At later visits during those times, we could tell that the doctors had started to medicate Chris because he became slow and sleepy. These visits were not fun because it seemed they had slowed down the happiness in him, but he was making important progress towards his recovery. Thankfully, it was just a matter of the doctors finding the correct balance of medications. Once that was achieved, Chris slowly returned to the Chris we all knew and loved. Our love, of course, enveloped him during this trauma he was enduring as well, but we were all happy to see improvements. I am uncertain exactly how long Chris had to remain at the Ottawa General this first time, but I know it was a few months. Thankfully, he was sent home to us in good time, and he really was the good old golden Chris that we all knew. Chris quickly adapted to being home with us once again, and soon fell back into his former routines, and even started to do work again with Dad and Bernie in the shop. I have the clearest memories of speaking with my mother and expressing my concerns regarding my beloved brother. She comforted me and explained that Chris would probably always be a little different from how he was going forward. She reassured me that this was okay, because this new part of him simply made him more special. I totally agreed. The doctors had explained their theories to my parents, and based upon their thoughts, Mom explained Christopher's illness to me. She asked me if I understood what diabetes was and what caused it. I confirmed to her that I did. I told her that generally folks with diabetes have a problem with their pancreas, where it no longer made enough insulin to control sugar levels in their body. Mother said, therefore, they need to watch their sweet intake, and in more severe cases need to take insulin to make sure that the sugar levels in their blood are properly regulated. I know this, Mom, I understand, I replied. She continued, well, it seems your brother has a chemical, not insulin, but a chemical missing in his system, in his brain, and this causes his illness. He has a chemical imbalance. His body no longer produces a chemical that keeps him more like the rest of the world. She then reassured me that with proper medication and treatment, Chris would be just fine. Chris indeed was just fine for the rest of his life. He only had a few hiccups from time to time when he may have missed medication, or if he underwent a bigger than normal change in his life. Christopher's mental health, as mentioned earlier, was almost always stable, but there were a few times when the best care for him, in rare setbacks, was at a hospital. He did spend some time at the Shawville Hospital closer to home, a place where he adored the nurses and the care given to him by them on a few occasions over the years. As well, he had some stays at the Ottawa General in the first decade since his diagnosis, and later in his 40s and 50s, he had some stays at the Pierre Janet and Sacred Heart hospitals in Gatineau, Quebec, all of which employed specialists in treating mental health. We all made efforts to visit Chris when he was hospitalized. When I was younger, I would travel with my parents or my brother Bernard to enjoy visits with Chris. Later, once I had moved to Ottawa, I would go see Chris after work when he was at the General Hospital in Ottawa, or across the river in Hull at the Pierre Janet, or the Sacred Heart hospitals. Though there were dozens of visits, I have heartfelt memories of these two. Number 1. The hospital visit memory I wish to share is a time during the mid-80s when difficult times for us in the Gauthier family were plentiful. In 1985, our father Cyril was diagnosed with a severe form of bone marrow cancer. He had not been feeling well for some time, and when he finally decided to seek help from a doctor, he was told that his cancer was serious, and sadly he was given only 1 to 5 years to live, and only if he accepted treatment. Dad started radiation and chemotherapy treatments, but the cancer was strong and took him from us in only 5 months. Shortly after Dad's illness was diagnosed, Chris felt very worried and sad. He had trouble coping with the severity of the situation. This family challenge of the day caused Chris to have a relapse, and he had to be hospitalized. As such, this was the time when our dear dad was hospitalized at the Ottawa Civic Hospital for cancer treatment, and our dear brother Chris was now at the Ottawa General Hospital for care of his mental state. Mom and my siblings would travel from Otter Lake to Ottawa as often as they could to visit both Dad and Chris. On the weekdays, I took my turn to visit both Dad and Chris. Dad held strong and faced his critical situation bravely. Chris, however, was not coping well. I would bus to the General Hospital from the west end of Ottawa on the very long OC Transpo 85 bus route and arrive at the hospital shortly after 6 p.m. I would find my brother in his hospital room talking or praying softly to himself. My arrival would bring excitement to his eyes. Right away, he indeed recognized me, but had trouble expressing what he wanted to say. Despite all this, I opened my arms and would say, "Hey Chris, I am happy to be here despite everything going on. Can I have a Chrissy Bear hug?" Chris would leap out of his bed and come and grab me so tight in a hug that I felt like a grizzly just hugged me. I would ask him to come walk with me down the long hospital corridors, and I would try to fill him in on what was going on with our father. When I mentioned Dad, he would tear up. I would burst out into tears as well. Chris would grab me right there and then and hug me. He would motion that I should wipe my tears on his hospital gown. With sadness suddenly over with, somewhere out of the blue, his speech would be clear, and he would ask me if I had any money, and if we could share a bag of chips and Coke with him. We would walk down to the area where the automated snack machines were, and I happily purchased chips and a Coke to share. Upon our return to his room, we would sit on his bed and we would share our treat together. Soon, though, it was time for me to leave, because I still needed to get to the Civic Hospital for a visit with Dad before the end of visiting hours. Although Chris was not clear in his conversation abilities during that visit, he managed to say, "Bye, Rick. Thank you. I love you." When Dad died, Chris's doctors feared that the emotions of such a tragic event would not be good for Chris, and recommended that he not attend the wake or funeral. It was hard for all of us, but especially for Chris, because he was not able to attend Dad's farewell. Years later, Chris spoke to me about this fact and expressed how sad he was that he could not say goodbye to our father. Chris and I walked that afternoon to the cemetery, and we both lay field flowers on our father's grave and spent some quality time there sharing our memories of our dad and remembering all he had accomplished in his life. We talked about the future and supporting our mother the best we could now that she was a widow. We talked about each other and made promises to always stay close because life was precious. Number 2. Later in Christopher's life, at the beginning of the summer of 2018, Chris once again was having a bit of difficulty controlling his mental condition. When he had recovered and was sent home, he had expressed clearly that he knew what had caused this latest change in his health. Upon his release from his summer 2018 hospital stay, he had explained to me that it was probably because he did not take his medication properly for a few days, was starting to have more serious kidney problems directly related to his diabetes, and had a bad bladder infection. These factors combined got him off balance. With his kidneys not working as well as they should, this caused a chemical imbalance. At any rate, skipping back to the beginning of the summer, by mid-June, when Chris was still at home in Otter Lake, I had noticed a slight change in Chris's ability to carry on a conversation when we had one of our regular phone calls. I spoke with our brother Bernard about it, and he agreed that he would monitor Chris for other changes. Chris did not improve much, and unfortunately, by midsummer, Chris was admitted once again to the Shawville Hospital for treatment. When it was determined that his kidneys were not functioning as well as they should, Chris was transferred to the Sacred Heart Core Hospital in Gatineau. That summer, I was fortunate to be working in Gatineau and was able to visit Chris several times a week after working hours. Since I am an avid walker, I could easily walk from my office to the hospital in about 30 minutes. Or if I was working from home, my walk would only take me about 1 hour. When I would arrive, I would always come across a smiling face, despite any mental state that I would find Chris in. On good days when conversation flowed easier, I would be instantly asked upon my arrival, "Hey Rick, did you bring me a Diet Pepsi and a bag of chips?" Though Chris adored these treats, these were now no-nos because of his newly diagnosed failing kidneys. I instead brought him puffed rice wafers and cranberry juice. Upon receiving these indulgences, he would then say, "Well, these are not chips and a bottle of pop, but I guess they will have to do." He would then continue by joking, "Maybe you should eat these dog biscuits and I will have the nurses sneak me in the good stuff later." We would always have a good laugh. Chris spent the majority of that summer in the hospital. It was a hard time for him because summertime was his favorite season. All he wanted to do was to have a grilled burger together somewhere or to go fishing before the summer ended. We would talk about these adventures and dream about them and plan for them, but alas, we both knew that nothing could be planned until Chris was discharged. The summer of 2018 was very hot, and poor Chris suffered in the terrible heat in his hospital room. The Sacred Heart Hospital did not have air conditioning in the patient rooms, and this made his long stay uncomfortable. On the heavy heat days, we would both bow down to and give thanks the most honorable floor fan, because at least it gave us a bit of a breeze. I was always there over his supper time and would help him eat. I have very happy memories of both of us trying to demystify the puzzling hospital food arrangement on his tray. Chris would often make me laugh when he would describe the different foods. According to Chris, tea was swamp water, soup was dishwater, bread was a sponge, eggs were tire rubber, and anything chicken or fish was simply yucky. What he preferred the most of all the chow options provided to him were the bowl of Jell-O and the container of yogurt. He would explain that at least these could be easily distinguished as to what they actually were. What a funny guy Chris could be. If we could, we would go for a walk in the hallways and Chris would introduce me to some nurses that we met along the way. He did not always remember their names, but he would whisper to me that one of them would end up being his girlfriend, and for sure. And if they decided to get married, he wanted me to be part of his wedding party. Our evenings would end with us listening to the radio, or perhaps watching some television. Before he got tucked into bed, we had our last hug, and I would have to leave. On my way out the door, he would often call me back and say, "Hey Rick, there's always time for one more hug." He would open his arms and I would glide back to his side for one more Chrissy Bear hug. The night concluded with whispers of goodbye and "I love you" said in unison. I am sure both of us wiped our tears quietly away. I know I did. I am certain Chris did. Chris recovered and was discharged at the end of summer. For the longest time, he did well and resumed a very normal life back in Otter Lake at home with Bernie. His kidneys seemed to be working again, and this improved both his physical and mental health. Sadly, however, in 2019, the terrible effects of long-term diabetes and years of taking medication affected his kidneys once more, and it was determined that he would now need to have regular dialysis treatment to clean the toxins from his blood supply. The dialysis treatment seemed to be working, and he did improve greatly, but by the end of 2019, his health started to change. He became hospitalized once again in early 2020. Between February and the end of May 2020, both his physical and mental health started to rapidly degrade. Chris spent this time at Shawville Hospital, his long-term care home, and the Sacred Heart Hospital in Hull. It was a difficult time for me because, as we all know, COVID-19 hit like a sledgehammer and changed everything. I so much wanted to go to be with my brother who was just across the Ottawa River, but was not able to because the border between Ontario and Quebec was closed. Should I have been able to cross to Quebec, the hospital with its strict new rules would have refused me access inside. Phone calls were possible at times, but were rare and strange, because Christopher's mental state had deteriorated. We all did the best we could under the circumstances. Our dear brother became weaker and weaker, and based upon doctors' reports, he was not doing well, was having more and more serious crisis because his systems were shutting down. By the end of May, based upon doctor recommendations, Christopher's dialysis treatments were to end, and he would be sent to palliative care in Shawville. I am happy for this, and not for Christopher's fate, but because it gave my siblings the opportunity to finally visit Chris and reassure him that we were all still there for him and that we all loved him. My sister Audrey permitted a last few phone calls between Chris and me. They were difficult calls. Chris died of renal failure and complications from bipolar disease on June 3, 2020. I love him. I miss him, my beloved brother. Please rest in peace, dearest Christopher. This was a difficult story to tell, reader, so I appreciate your interest in knowing more about my much-loved brother. Thank you.